20,000 soldiers marched into the trees with the arrogance of gods, believing the road was theirs to command. But the forest was not a territory. It was a living trap that slowly consumed their discipline into a slurry of mud and panic. 3 entire legions were erased not by a grand battle, but by the crushing realization that their armor had become a cage. The machine did not break, it simply sank. The forest did not welcome them. It tolerated them, waiting for the moment when the intrusion would become too deep to withdraw. For the men of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, the boundary between the civilized world and the void was not a line on a map, but the sudden, oppressive shift in the quality of the light. Here, beneath the interlocking canopy of ancient oaks, the sun was a rumor, a pale gray memory filtered through layers of dripping leaves that turned the air into a semi-aquatic gloom. The silence of the birds was the first anomaly, a heavy, unnatural quiet that should have served as a warning siren to the veteran centurions, but it was masked by the relentless, hypnotic drumming of the rain. It had been falling for hours, a cold, miserable sheet of water that did not cleanse the earth, but turned it into a traitorous, clinging slurry. This was not a march of conquest. It was a slow, grinding migration of a mobile city that had forgotten it was supposed to be an army. The columns stretched for miles, a serpentine beast of iron and leather that moved with a lethargic, disjointed rhythm, encumbered by the heavy baggage of an empire that believed comfort was a right, even in the heart of the wilderness. They carried more than just weapons. They carried the arrogance of Rome in the form of heavy wagons laden with furniture, servants, and the administrative debris of a governor who treated the frontier like a pacified province. Publius Quintilius Varus rode near the front, his posture relaxed, his mind likely occupied with the trivialities of tax collection and judicial disputes, blind to the fact that the road his engineers were hacking through the undergrowth was not a permanent mark, but a temporary breach that the forest was already healing behind him. The mud grasped at the caligae of the legionaries, adding pounds of dead weight to every step, turning the simple act of walking into a physical battle against the terrain. Leather armor, usually a second skin of protection, soaked up the deluge until it hung heavy and sodden on aching shoulders, pulling the men down into a permanent slump of exhaustion. There was no enemy in sight, yet the soldiers felt watched. The trees, thick and gnarled, seemed to crowd the narrow track, their branches interlocked like the bars of a cage that had been quietly locked by an unseen jailer. The usual sharp, crisp sounds of a Roman march, the rhythmic tramp of boots, the clatter of equipment, the bark of orders, were swallowed by the damp moss and the noise of the wind. Commands did not travel. They died in the wet air, isolating each cohort in its own private struggle against the elements. The discipline that had conquered the Mediterranean was being eroded not by fear of a tribal horde, but by the sheer, miserable physics of the environment. They were walking into the depths of the world, and with every mile they advanced, the trap closed a little tighter, unseen and unheard, preparing to consume the pride of Augustus whole. To the commanders riding high on their horses, the struggle against the mud was an annoyance, not an omen, because the Roman worldview was built on the unshakable conviction that nature was merely another tribal force waiting to be subjugated by engineering. The logic governing the column was the product of 7 centuries of military evolution, a system of warfare so refined that it had reduced the act of combat to a mathematical certainty. In their minds, they were not walking into a trap. They were conducting a routine administrative transfer through a pacified territory, a necessary exertion to bring the light of law to the dark corners of the frontier. This confidence was not born of arrogance alone, but of empirical evidence. The legions had crushed the phalanxes of Macedon, burned the walls of Carthage, and broken the wild charges of the Gauls, always proving that discipline and geometry were superior to fury. The structure of the army was designed to be an autonomous state, a moving city of iron that carried its own walls, its own laws, and its own gods, rendering the surrounding environment irrelevant. Every centurion knew his place in the hierarchy, every soldier knew his role in the formation, and this intricate web of command was believed to be unbreakable, a nervous system that could react to any threat with the speed of a reflex. The security of the march was further guaranteed by the presence of the man riding at the right hand of the governor, a figure who embodied the success of Rome's civilizing mission. Arminius was not seen as a potential threat, but as the ultimate validation of imperial policy. A prince of the Cherusci who had been taken as a ward, raised in Rome, trained in the legions, and granted the coveted status of a Roman citizen and an equestrian. He spoke Latin with the fluency of a senator, wore his armor with the ease of a veteran, and understood the tactical doctrine of the empire better than many of the tribunes who now looked down on the mud with disdain. To Varus, Arminius was the bridge between the untamed past and the ordered future, the living proof that the German tribes could be tamed and integrated into the Pax Romana. The intelligence he provided was treated as fact. His scouts were the eyes of the army, and his assurance that the uprising to the north was a minor local disturbance was the foundation upon which the entire campaign rested. The trust placed in him was absolute because it confirmed what the Romans desperately wanted to believe, that their culture was so superior that even the tribes would eventually volunteer to defend it. This belief in the inevitability of Roman order created a blindness that masqueraded as wisdom. The commanders looked at the dense forest and saw only timber for future fleets. They looked at the narrow, boggy path and saw the route of a future highway that would be paved with stone. They were not preparing for a battle because the calculus of war declared it impossible. No tribal chieftain would be reckless enough to attack 3 full legions in open war, and the Germans were known to be too fractured by internal feuds to organize a unified resistance. The sheer size of the Roman force was considered its own best defense, a mass of 20,000 men that possessed a gravitational pull strong enough to deter any aggression. The heavy baggage train, the servants, and the camp followers were not liabilities in this equation, but symbols of permanence, signaling to the forest that Rome had arrived not to visit, but to stay. The slow pace was interpreted as dignity, the lack of urgency as control. Even as the rain continued to fall and the path narrowed, forcing the formation to stretch thinner and thinner, the officers maintained the illusion of a parade ground, correcting the lines and shouting for silence, convinced that if they simply maintained the appearance of order, reality would eventually conform to their expectations. They were protected by the invisible armor of their history, marching forward under the assumption that the rules of war which applied in the open plains of the Mediterranean would hold true in the suffocating gloom of the north, unaware that they had stepped out of the world of logic and into a place where geometry held no power. The first fracture in the illusion of control appeared not with hostility, but with a seemingly routine administrative decision that would later be recognized as the unlatching of the gate. As the terrain grew more rugged and the path narrowed between the encroaching hills and the dense swampland, the column was forced to elongate, stretching the army into a fragile 14-mile thread that made communication between the vanguard and the rearguard physically impossible. It was in this moment of structural vulnerability that Arminius rode to the front, offering a suggestion that sounded entirely logical to Roman ears. He would ride ahead to rally the local auxiliary forces, bringing fresh German troops to assist in clearing the road and securing the flanks. To Varus, this was not a desertion, but a demonstration of loyalty, a proactive measure by a trusted ally to ease the logistical burden of the march. The governor granted permission with a dismissive wave of his hand, interpreting the departure as the system working exactly as intended, unaware that he was watching his betrayer ride out to position the trap. The departure was smooth, professional, and devoid of drama, leaving the Romans alone in the deepening gloom with nothing but their confidence to keep them warm. Shortly after the German prince vanished into the mist, the anomalies began to accumulate at the edges of the column, small irregularities that the officers were quick to categorize as mundane frustrations. A wagon axle snapped in the mud, halting a section of the line and creating a gap that the heavy rain quickly obscured from view. When the centurions shouted for the stragglers to catch up, the only response was the sound of the wind hissing through the pines. Men who stepped into the undergrowth to relieve themselves simply did not return, their absence initially attributed to desertion or the carelessness of undisciplined conscripts. The officers, trained to solve problems of order, interpreted these disappearances through the lens of military law rather than tactical survival. They saw a lack of morale that needed to be punished, not a hidden threat that needed to be fought. The cries that occasionally drifted from the rear were dismissed as the result of localized quarrels or accidents involving the heavy equipment, the noise dampened and distorted by the heavy, wet air until it lost its urgency. The first act of overt hostility was so sudden and isolated that it failed to register as the start of a war. A javelin flew from the dense tree line, striking a legionary's armor, but before the man hit the ground, the assailant had already melted back into the shadows. The immediate reaction of the nearby troops was not to form a battle line, which the terrain rendered impossible, but to shout for the medics and curse the audacity of local bandits. The command structure categorized the incident as a criminal act rather than a military engagement, a nuisance raid by desperate thieves looking to steal a mule or a bag of grain. This misclassification was fatal. It allowed the army to continue marching forward, pushing deeper into the trap under the assumption that they were dealing with a law enforcement issue. The order remained to keep moving, to ignore the harassment, and to trust that the sheer size of the legion would eventually discourage the attackers. They believed they were swatting at flies, unaware that these were the first stinging scouts of a swarm that had already surrounded them. As the afternoon wore on, the frequency of these accidents increased, creating a low-frequency hum of anxiety that began to vibrate through the ranks. The gaps in the line grew wider as the mud worsened, isolating centuries from their cohorts and cohorts from their legions. Runners sent to relay orders to the rear returned with pale faces or did not return at all, severing the nervous system of the army piece by piece. Yet the momentum of the march continued, driven by the inertia of 20,000 men who could not simply stop in the middle of a swamp. The officers continued to enforce discipline, shoving men who flinched at the rustling of the leaves, demanding that shields be held high and eyes kept forward. They were fighting to maintain the geometry of the march, believing that as long as the lines remained straight, the world would make sense. They did not understand that the enemy was not attacking the line. The enemy was dismantling the space in which the line existed, turning the very ground they walked on into a weapon. The warning signs were everywhere: the silence of the woods, the missing scouts, the localized ambushes. But the Roman mind, conditioned by centuries of dominance, could only interpret them as friction, not as the prelude to ruin. The machine was malfunctioning, but the operators refused to believe it was broken, pushing the gears to grind harder even as the sand began to pour into the engine. The transition from a military march to a slow-motion catastrophe was not marked by a single decisive order, but by the terrifying realization that the machinery of the legion had begun to consume itself. As the ambush intensified, the standard operating procedures that had ensured Roman dominance for centuries, the instinct to close ranks, to hold ground, to wait for commands, transformed into the very mechanisms of their destruction. The soldiers, drilled to obey the trumpet blasts that cut through the noise of battle, found themselves paralyzed when the only sound was the relentless drumming of rain and the cries of fallen men that seemed to come from every direction at once. They tightened their formations as they had been taught, locking shields to create a wall of iron. But in the narrow, waterlogged path, this density did not offer protection. It merely created a target-rich environment for the invisible archers hidden in the canopy. The pilum, designed to pierce shields and disrupt charges, became a useless weight in hands that could not find room to pull back and throw. The gladius, the short sword that had carved the empire out of the world, was rendered impotent against an enemy that refused to close the distance, striking instead with missiles from the safety of the trees. The discipline that defined them was now a cage. To break rank was treason, but to hold rank was certain death. In the center of this contracting world, Publius Quinctilius Varus remained mounted, a focal point for a chain of command that had already been severed. He issued orders that were swallowed by the chaos, dispatched runners who vanished into the undergrowth, and waited for reports that would never arrive. The sophisticated nervous system of the army, which relied on the rapid transmission of information from the centurions to the tribunes and up to the legate, had suffered a total neurological collapse. The legion was no longer a single, cohesive organism capable of reacting to stimuli. It had fractured into hundreds of isolated, terrified islands, each fighting a private war in a green, suffocating twilight. Cohorts that should have been supporting one another were separated by walls of mud and fallen timber, unaware of whether their comrades were fighting, fleeing, or already dead. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against the logic of the empire. Heavy supply wagons, now hopelessly mired in the sludge, became obstacles that blocked retreat and fractured the lines further, turning the road into a bottleneck of panic where men were trampled not by the enemy, but by the desperate weight of their own baggage. The physical toll of the environment began to override the psychological training of the soldiers. The mud was not just a hindrance, it was an active antagonist, a grasping force that drained the energy from legs already trembling with fatigue. Armor that had been polished to a shine was now caked in filth, the leather straps waterlogged and constricting, turning the protection of the state into a heavy, suffocating burden. Men slipped and fell, and in the crush of the panic formation, many did not rise again, pressed into the earth by the sandals of their brothers, who were too terrified to look down. The sacred eagles, the golden totems that embodied the soul of the legion, and for which every man was sworn to die, bobbed unsteadily above the sea of helmets. They were no longer rallying points for a counterattack, but desperate, wavering beacons that signaled to the enemy exactly where the heart of the Roman resistance lay. The bearers held them aloft with trembling arms, knowing that the gold they carried was a magnet for every arrow and javelin in the forest. Yet they did not drop them. They clung to the symbols of order, even as the reality of chaos tore them apart, marching blindly forward because the system offered no protocol for a world that had ceased to make sense. The army was still moving, still breathing, and still ostensibly under command, but it was dead on its feet, a specter of the empire shambling toward a grave it was digging with its own discipline. By the morning of the fourth day, the geographical noose tightened to its final, choking diameter. The survivors, sleepless and hollowed out by 72 hours of relentless attrition, stumbled into the bottleneck at Calcrisa, a narrow strip of land squeezed between the steep, wooded slopes of the Calcrisa Hill and the impassable black mire of the Great Bog. Here the final architectural element of the trap revealed itself, stripping away the last desperate hope that this was merely a running battle against disorganized tribesmen. Running along the base of the hill was a turf wall, an engineered fortification topped with a palisade, built with a precision that mirrored Roman efficiency. It was not a hastily erected barricade. It was a ground prepared for destruction months in advance, a permanent structure designed for the specific purpose of halting a column that Arminius knew would come. The wall transformed the open forest into a corridor of no return, forcing the Romans to march with their unshielded right flanks exposed to the high ground, while the swamp waited on their left to claim anyone who tried to recoil. The reaction of the legion was automatic, a reflex honed by centuries of drill, and it was exactly what the enemy had calculated. Upon seeing the wall and taking the first volley of heavy stones and spears from the ramparts, the officers shouted for the men to form a testudo, to lock shields and create a shell. But the terrain had been selected to weaponize this very instinct. The path was too narrow for the formation to expand, and the ground was too slick for the men to hold their footing against the impact of the assault. As the Germans poured down from the wall and emerged from the tree line, the Romans did what they were trained to do. They compressed. They sought safety and density, pushing inward to close the gaps, unknowingly obeying the physics of the trap. The center of the column became a solid block of humanity where movement ceased entirely. Men were pinned by the weight of their own comrades, their arms trapped at their sides, unable to raise a shield to deflect a blow or draw a gladius to strike back. The famed Roman discipline, the iron grid that allowed them to dominate the chaos of war, had twisted into a mechanism of paralysis. They were not fighting. They were simply waiting in line to be undone. The horror of the situation lay in its industrial efficiency. The enemy on the ridge did not need to engage in risky hand-to-hand combat. They simply threw their weapons into the dense mass below, knowing that every javelin would find flesh. The Roman command structure, already fractured, finally dissolved under the weight of the impossible geometry. Centurions who tried to organize a breakout were swept away by the panic of their own troops, or targeted by the German marksmen, who picked off the officers with chilling deliberation. The cavalry, the only force with the speed to potentially flank the wall, found themselves hemmed in by the infantry, their horses panicking in the crush, trampling the legionaries in a frantic attempt to escape the mud. The synergy of the combined arms, infantry, cavalry, and auxiliaries supporting one another, inverted into a chaotic struggle for space. The legion was no longer an army. It was a solid mass of fear, a single organism writhing in a pit, crushing itself in a desperate bid for oxygen and room that no longer existed. Arminius, watching from the high ground, had not just defeated the legions, he had turned their greatest strength into their tomb. He knew that a Roman army in the open field was invincible, a machine that could pivot and strike with lethal force. So he had denied them the field. He had used the forest to blind them, the rain to exhaust them, and finally the wall to compress them until their discipline became a sentence of doom. The soldiers dying in the mud were not victims of a fair fight. They were victims of a system that continued to function long after it had lost its purpose. They held their lines because they knew no other way to exist, standing shoulder to shoulder as the spears rained down, maintaining the formation of the cohort even as the cohort was erased. The tragedy was not that they broke and ran, but that they stood and died, faithful to a doctrine that had been engineered to kill them. The trap was absolute. There was no retreat, for the bog was endless. There was no advance, for the wall was impregnable. And there was no relief, for the silence of the forest silenced their cries before they could reach the ears of Rome. When the rain finally ceased, it did not leave behind the freshness of a storm past, but a silence so absolute that it pressed against the eardrums like a physical weight. The forest, having finished its work, settled into a stillness that was far more terrifying than the cacophony of the final hour. Beneath the dripping canopy, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions had been transmuted from a military force into a geological feature, a ridge of crushed bronze and silent forms that followed the contours of the defile. The mud, which had been their enemy for 4 days, now became their tomb, beginning to harden as the temperature dropped, locking the dead in the final, desperate postures of their struggle. There was no movement in the valley, no groans of the wounded, for the efficiency of the trap had been total. The ambush had not been designed to rout the enemy, but to erase him. The Roman eagle, the golden bird that had flown across the known world, lay face down in the mire, its wings bent and tarnished, no longer a symbol of divine favor, but merely a piece of heavy metal discarded in the dirt. The hierarchy that had governed the lives of 20,000 men, the strict delineations between legate, centurion, and common soldier, had been erased by the democracy of the pile. In the end, they were all just volume, filling the space the forest had carved for them. Publius Quinctilius Varus had performed his final duty not as a commander, but as a Roman aristocrat who understood that life had become a legal impossibility. By choosing his own end, he had attempted to assert one last measure of control over a body that the empire no longer owned. But even this gesture was swallowed by the indifference of the landscape. The victors did not treat his remains with the reverence due a worthy adversary. They treated it as debris, stripping the crimson cloak and the signet ring with the efficient, unsentimental motions of harvesters reaping a field. The token of his demise would eventually travel to Rome, not as a trophy of war, but as a message written in the language of decay, informing the Senate that their jurisdiction ended where the trees began. The German tribesmen moved through the twilight like ghosts, their torches casting long, dancing shadows over the ruin, collecting the iron harvest of the empire. They did not cheer. The scale of the destruction was too vast for celebration, leaving only a grim satisfaction that the iron cage had been broken. They walked upon the backs of the invaders because there was no bare ground left to step on, treading on the very breastplates that had been forged to enslave them. Far to the south, within the marble halls of the Palatine, the shockwave of this silence would arrive weeks later, shattering the peace of Augustus. The emperor, the architect of the Pax Romana, would be reduced to a grieving old man wandering the corridors, striking his fists against the stone and pleading with a ghost to return his legions. But the plea was futile. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were not merely subtracted from the army list, they were exiled from existence, never to be assigned to another unit, retired in shame as eternal placeholders for a catastrophe that could not be spoken of. The loss was not just military, it was psychological, a permanent scar on the Roman psyche that marked the end of the dream of a boundless empire. The Rhine was no longer a river to be crossed, it was a wall to be watched, a jagged line where the logic of civilization crumbled into the primal chaos of the woods. The expansion of Rome stopped here, not because they lacked the men to return, but because they had finally learned the lesson the forest had taught them, that there are places in the world that refuse to be measured, mapped, or owned. The battle was over, the dead were still, and the forest, indifferent and eternal, simply continued to grow over the ruin, slowly reclaiming the iron bones of the machine that had dared to think it could march in a straight line through a crooked world.